I'm Emily Berg, and I will be giving a presentation on my paper entitled Kansas's Failure to Adequately Fund Special Education Despite Legal Obligation is Enabled by a Lack of Accountability, Tolerance of Budget Shortfalls, and Unequal Distribution. I chose to research this topic because upon graduation, I plan to become a special education teacher. My stance on this subject is pro funding. We should be funding special education. In 1975, the United States government passed the Individuals with Disability Act, or IDEA. This act was for funding for special education students. The Kansas Department of Education in 1981 wanted to expand on the IDEA and create their own act. So they created the Special Education for Exceptional Children Act, or SEECA, and this was to fund special education. Now, to be eligible for special education, you had to have a learning disability, an intellectual disability, an emotional disturbance, a behavioral issue, have autism, or demonstrate a need. Gifted kids also fall under this category as well. Kids that are identified are placed on individual education plans, or IEPs. They could also be placed on a 504 plan, which is just a less detailed plan, but nonetheless, they still require and guarantee an equal and quality education. In the 1990s, the Kansas Department of Education had an informal goal of funding special education at 92% of the excess cost, which is the cost on top of what the school has already funded. Now, in 2005, they passed a law that Kansas would take that informal goal and make it permanent. So in 2005, the 92% became law. The Kansas Association of School Boards says that from 2005 to 2011 that the state consistently funded. They met their goal of 92%. But after 2011, that funding started to decrease. Now, within the last 5 years, it has still declined, and predictions show that it will keep declining. Tim Carpenter wrote an article called Kansas House Punts Funding Increase Commitment to Special Education in K through 10 Schools. He points out and writes about Laura Kelly in 2024 committing $73 million to special education funding. The House Appropriations Committee this year passed HB 2007, or House Bill 2007, which only upped special education funding by $10 million. So parents and districts are pretty frustrated by this. Now, the state does a funding formula, and it's called the State Foundation Aid Formula. And Dave Trabert wrote an article called Calculating Special Education Costs, and he wrote another one called Flawed Formula, Overfunded Special Education by at least $323 million. So with this formula, the state takes in the costs of special education, the cost of the regular education for the special education students, and federal aids. But Trabert also points out that there are two flaws, one for the opposing side and one for the supporting side. So the supporting side says one of the flaws is that it's not capturing all of the money. Now, the opposing side says it is capturing all the money and we're overfunding school districts and that school districts don't need any more funding. Now, Trabert says that there are 11 points to the funding formula, and two of the points are what highlights this problem. One point is that they determine the amount of general funds, which is all the funds for the school district, and their local option budgets, or LOBs. And these are based on your area, your location, your district, where you are. And then the second point is determining the amount of federal funds. So if you include those LOBs in the general costs, and then you exclude them from the special education costs, if you add those costs back in, it shows an overfunding. So if you include if you include the LOBs in just the general ed, there's no special education funding. But if you add that in, then it shows the overage of the special education. Now, these costs are passed on to school districts, and the school districts have to pick up those pieces. So the state is lacking accountability. There's no enforcement of their own law, and they're just passing on the costs. So school districts will pull money from their general fund to bridge the gap between special education funding and the state funding that they have gotten. So when they pull this general money to special education, sometimes that results in cutting programs, not starting new programs, not updating technology, and not being able to hire staff, appropriate staff. And the state has not kept up with inflation or the rising cost of education or the rising number of special education students in school districts. And the school districts that suffer the most are the lower income school districts. They're the one that suffer the most from this. So the next issue with lack of funding is special education staff, paraeducators. There's a high turnover rate for special education paraeducators. They don't feel appreciated, they're underpaid. Sometimes they just don't have the training. They don't understand the difficulty of the job. So it leads for them to find jobs elsewhere and a lack of qualified staff. So the Department of Education for the state of Kansas in 2024 has reported that lower income schools, all schools, saw a reduction in funding. And some lower income schools saw funding go away by over $100,000. Now, the Kansas Department of Education in 2025, funding had little to no change, as there were no budget cuts and there was no increase in funding from the state. So the schools that got hurt the worst are lower income schools and special services schools, which are schools that serve kids from 18 to 21, job placement and acclimating them to being on their own. Now, there are differing views from both sides, parents and lawmakers. Some support defunding and stripping state funding from schools. Some support increasing funding for schools and special education. Some parents are upset that the money is coming from the general fund and activities for students to cover special education funding. And that is a problem. So Kaylee McLaughlin wrote an article called Johnson County Superintendents Warn Districts Will Lose Millions for Special Education if State Funding Bill Passes. Well, HB 2007 did pass. But before it did, the superintendents for several school districts in Johnson County let the state know how they felt and what it could do for their districts. And one of the school districts reported losing $200,000 in funding when that bill passed. Now, Kansas lawmakers have different views as well. The Republicans want massive spending cuts. They want massive cuts for special education and for general education. Some Republican lawmakers think that schools are misusing their money, they're spending it elsewhere, and they're basically taking away from their own special education funding. Democrats want to expand funding. They want to make sure every kid is getting an appropriate education, whether in special education or not. So the schools that are affected the most are lower income schools. And this is because of their tax base. They don't have the tax base that a Topeka area would, or Kansas City, or a bigger area would. They have to find a way to cover the big budget gap that is left from the state and from their own monies. Some of these schools can't bridge that gap. They don't have the money. And it doesn't help that parents in these schools will find better programs and they will move to different schools. So when you have a decrease in student population, you also have a decrease in funding. And the state for the last 14 years has failed to fully fund special education. And now the state is citing that there is misuse of funds in school districts, but they have no proof. And it's interesting because the state of Kansas requires that school districts submit yearly reports of their expenditure budgets for their fiscal year. So kind of takes away the argument that they're misusing their funds. But for these taxes and funding, you have your state tax base, your state funding, your federal funding, and donations. Um, it has been seen that the Kansas state of Kansas has enough revenue to fully fund special education and chooses not to. So, funding has always been an issue at the state level. It's always been a battle, and now it's currently a battle on the federal level as well. With the dismantling of the Department of Education and the very true threat of the issue of IDEA, of maybe losing funding through IDEA. And that could set a very dangerous precedent for states, that the feds don't have to do it, so we don't have to do it. And school districts could lose a lot, not just in special education, but in general education as well. So that's an issue. But there are very real and current threats to education, not just at a federal level, but at a state level, and we should all be paying attention. Parents are going to be left with picking up pieces if funding is gone. Not everybody can pay for a private education or religious education. And then on top of that, private schools and religious schools usually don't have special education programs, and they don't offer as many rights as public schools do. You have more rights as a special education student in a public school than you do a private school. And private schools can't always fund special education, and neither can religious schools because they only have so much tuition and they only have so much budget as well. So in conclusion, the state has not been holding its end of the deal. This year, it's in the next 5 years, it looks like funding could be decreased to 65% in the state of Kansas. That's a far cry from the 92%. Districts are going to have to start making difficult decisions. Parents are going to have to start making difficult decisions. And it's very real and it's very present. And I think anybody that has a child in the Kansas education system needs to be paying attention to what's going on. If you have a special education student, you need to be paying attention to what's going on. You don't know if your neighbor next door, if that child is on free or reduced lunch. You don't know if your kid's best friend has a learning disability and is on a 504 plan. You don't know all the moving parts. And so everybody should be paying attention to what's going on in education. Even as online students, college students, we should all be paying attention. And that, and because it's a big deal. We need to fund education, and we really need to take care of our special education students, because they don't always have a voice. They don't always have someone that's in their corner. And when you have funding to have special education staff, as like myself, supporting these students, that's where they can find their voice. And that's where, we can fight for them. So pay attention, and thank you for listening to my presentation.